Tonight's presentation training for the 400 meters, John Henson has kindly agreed to join us. So the basics, long sprints. The main difference for sprints between specifically the 1, 2 and the 4s and the short sprint or short hurdles and long hurdles, his main difference is having to handle the effects of fatigue. We're going to have a look at the energy systems used later on, and whilst some of the energy systems are very similar between the 2s and 4s, the fact that we are using certain energy systems for longer leads to significant athlete fatigue, and means that it's something that they need to train to handle and to improve on. It really is an event the athletes need to learn, much more than perhaps the 1s and 2s. It's an athlete they need to train for, and we need to prepare them for. So whilst John and I probably aren't going to give you a full coaching program tonight, what we will hopefully do is give you a few ideas about different things we do, different things we've started to introduce, how we set up our training programs and what we actually do, and perhaps just give you a couple of different viewpoints that you can then start to take away, and it might help inform your training programs going forwards. Causes for fatigue are numerous. I've taken these off a presentation elsewhere, but the main ones are lack of energy, the ATP system availability relative to the demand of the event, the accumulation of metabolites impairing muscle contraction, again, which we will touch on briefly. Big one for me is improper sprint mechanics, which we'll pick up and look at. Repeated high force impacts. It's still a sprint. We are training athletes to produce massive amount of force through a very long, prolonged period, and therefore it's something that we really need to prepare them for. And another big one is uneven race distribution, again, which we'll pick up as we go through the presentation. The starting point for me for coaching is reducing improper speed mechanics. For me, it's the biggest quick win that you can have. We've looked in previous webinars at speed mechanics. We don't intend to touch on these very much through this. We will touch on elements of it, but not go through those elements massively. But just one thing I put to the athletes is just consider sort of the following. Your stride length non-fatigued over 400 meters for a world-class athlete is 2.55 meters. Stride length fatigue is 2.33 meters. So if we apply the fatigue stride length over, say, the last 100 and the non-fatigue over the first 3, that gives them 160 strides per that they'll make in the race. If we can make a difference by just 1/100th of a second on each of those strides, by making them actually impact in the right place, actually not fall onto the foot, think about getting the foot back, whatever it may be, that's going to knock just that one thing 1.6 seconds off their time. So for me, the starting point with 400 meter coaching, and again, we'll pick up on this, is when we start specializing, things like that, is really to start really working on their technique. That to me is where I can gain the biggest gains and pick it up from there. So the start of the training has to be understanding the biomechanics of the sprint. It is still a sprint. It's a slightly different sprint. There is less force created, less travel time, but it is still a sprint. So my starting point with all 400 meter athletes is to make sure that they're mechanically sound, stable, they've got some strength ahead of stabilization. Technical input before hard work, always try and get them technically strong before we start bringing in the hard work. When to specialize younger athletes. I don't know, John, do you have any views on when you bring your athletes through, what you work on, and when you actually start to get them to specialize?
Well, obviously, it depends on the maturity, physical maturity of the athlete themselves. Some athletes mature very early and can handle more hard work at a younger age. So you've got to know very closely the athlete that you're catering for. But, generally, I would have thought you don't want to specialize in the 400 much under about 18 years of age. You want to try all the events, both the below and above sometimes the 400, to see, where you are physically with that particular athlete. So I would say, try all the events, but don't, if he or she is really determined that 400 meters is the goal for them, then 17, 18 years old is probably a good idea, a good age to start specializing.
Yeah, I'm very much the same as John. We work on a range of speed events, and very rarely get an athlete to work on or focus on fours totally until they are really in the under 20 age group. It's a fairly physically demanding event, and I want them to be fast before we start to drop through and start to drop them into into the training that's required and that we'll look at. So a big thing for that is when you do introduce it, introduce a specific training gradually. I'm not a big one for massive change over a short period of time. I tend to find that leads to athlete breakdown. So I do try over the first season to perhaps to do mix them in one night doing ones and twos with the shorter sprinters, depending on what they're doing, one night doing perhaps from the four specialist training, and gradually introduce it rather than dropping it, and just see how they handle it and decide whether that works or not for them. Is that a similar approach to what you take, John?
Yes, yeah. I think that's a very sensible approach. We do try and work before that age. I really think it's very, very important to maximize the speed potential overall, because as you will point out later, with the difference between the first 200 and the last 200, the faster you are over 200, the more comfortable you are in the first 200 going through in your target time. So I think it's vital before you start to specialize that you really work on maximizing the speed potential of any particular athlete.
Brilliant. And John's already picked up, determine the type of athlete. Are they a two runner moving out to the fours, or are they an 800 meter runner moving into the fours? And that may inform where you want to spend perhaps more training than you would do. So twos, you may be looking a bit more endurance. Eights coming down to fours, you may be looking at a bit more speed within your training programs. I'm not intending to go through this in massive detail, but it's important when you coach the fours or coach any of the sprints really, to really understand the energy systems you're going to use during that, because I'm a firm believer in that you need to train those energy systems in order to maximize the athlete's potential. John's going to pick up a bit more on the energy systems, especially around the aerobic capacity in a minute, but it's worth having a quick flick through. So obviously, I will talk you through these in very brief detail in a second, but just show you this slide of looking at the fuels used in the 100. So the phosphocreatine, which I'll briefly talk you through, it forms roughly half, the anaerobic glycolysis roughly half. As we can see in the 2, phosphocreatine is a lot less. And we'll discuss why anaerobic glycolysis is a large proportion more, with a portion of aerobic glycolysis at the side. As John will discuss in a sec, the energy systems work hand in hand. They don't work, you don't switch from one to the other and then one from to another. They work together, as pretty much is shown in that diagram. You can see them all working at the same time. In the 400, phosphocreatine lasts over a sort of longer period. The anaerobic glycolysis is a much bigger element, very similar to the 2, but it's maintained over a much longer period. And the aerobic glycolysis, again, a larger element than in the 2, but very, very similar to the 2, just taken over a longer period. So very briefly, just to give you some sort of background on those, the ATP CP system, that's basically your alactic anaerobic system. It utilizes a ready source of energy that's stored in your muscles. It's the old flight for fright energy source that basically, if, you know, when we were caveman and bear decided to chase us, that's the stuff that kicks in. It doesn't need oxygen to work. It's purely anaerobic. It's a readily sourced muscle-bound food energy that allows us to, you know, over a very, very short period to actually sprint without actually having to use anything else. So obviously in the 100, that is one of the predominant sources of energy. It takes quite a long time for that to get back into the muscles. So this is why if you're doing a pure speed session and you're looking at utilizing that, you've got to give fairly long recoveries in between in order for that to resynthesize. I think you had a point to pick up on that about how it actually works, John.
Well, yes. Basically, as I understand it, at any rate, the ATP, the adenosine triphosphate, is broken down. One molecule of the triphosphate is used to produce the energy, leaving adenosine biphosphate, and during the recovery period, this is resynthesized using phosphocreatine back into the useful energy store, which is the adenosine triphosphate. So that is basically the circular system that, as I understand it, that it works on. But, you know, relating this to the 400 meters, obviously we're talking about it lasting 4 to 6 seconds when you're working at maximum capacity. But in the 400, obviously, although you need to start off in a very your acceleration is quite strong. It's not explosive like it is in 100 meters. So the ATP system probably lasts a few 2 or 3 seconds longer than it normally would if you were operating at maximum effort. So that's as I understand it, at any rate.
Brilliant. Anaerobic glycolysis system is basically the stuff that produces lactic acid. So roughly, as John said, after 10 seconds, the body store of creatine phosphate is depleted, and ATP must be resynthesized using different source. The anaerobic system, and this basically comes from the carbohydrates that's stored in the liver and the muscles as glycogen. There's much more stores of glycogen in the body than there is so it can last longer than there is the creatine phosphate or phosphate creatine. And because there's no oxygen, what we get is glycogen changing to glucose to pyruvic acid, and then creating the energy that's created, which turns to lactic acid. The anaerobic glycolysis system converts glycogen to glucose, which is broken down anaerobically. And this is why the athletes actually produce lactic acid. They're actually running anaerobically, breaking down glycogen that's stored in the body. It's creating a byproduct. That byproduct starts to change the acidity, the pH of the blood, and prevents the enzymes working, eventually leading to fatigue. So that briefly explains the sort of system about what they're working in, how they're working, and why they're working that. Aerobic applies slightly to 400s. Myself and John were having a chat about how much it's applied before we actually came properly live on air. Mainly used for endurance, uses oxygen, relies on fat and carbohydrates. Lactic acid isn't produced it's a breakdown using oxygen. There's not the byproducts. We can go a lot longer on that, but not at the type of speeds which we are doing for 400s. But there's been a lot of research, which we will touch on in a second, on 2 points. One is actually how much of the aerobic system is used in the 400. And the other one is actually, if you increase aerobic capacity for the athletes, how important that is for actually decreasing their use of the anaerobic system when they're actually racing. So probably really quite important in 2 parts, which we'll pick up as we go through.